Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast. I am delighted to be with you here today. I am sporting green. It is St. Patrick's Day. It is Monday, March 17th, 2025. While I am pumped and ready to talk to you today and give you a market overview of everything happening, the market is not so pumped. So today we are really going to cover the main themes in the market. Really, I think it's about the economy, it's consumer sentiment, and oil prices. And I am about to head to Houston to speak at the Houston Producers Forum tomorrow. So probably going to record about 15 or 20 minutes of this, and then we'll record the back end either tonight when I land in Houston or when I come back. So right now, we are sitting at $67.56 for WTI. We are looking at $71 and $71.05 for Brent. Henry Hub is really taking a little bit of a beating. We're back down under four at $3.98. Dutch ETF dollar per MMBTU, that's European natural gas prices, are $13.51. And the 10-year yield is flirting, it's 4.306%. So, again, that correlates to the 30-year mortgage, and that is probably still around, it's just shy of 7%. So a lot of things going on with both within the oil market, within the economy, and within the consumer sentiment. And so last week we had a slug of information come out, including consumer sentiment. But you also had a few things happening. So if you're watching the stock market and you're also trying to follow oil prices, there was so much going on. So Zero Week was happening, and there was a lot of noise there. And I'm going to spend some time at this Houston Producers Forum in my short 40-minute presentation. I'm going to spend some time talking about the capitulation, that was at Zero Week. But there was, so you had all that. You had a JP Morgan conference that was going on airlines on March 11th. And then you also had Kohl's earnings calls, which was on Kohl's was March 11th. Costco was March 6th. And so there's a kind of a tale of, we used to think it was like a two-tailed economy, right? Where you have the lower income consumer and the higher income consumer. And certainly the higher income consumer in the last year or so has really been holding up the economy. But you have a lot of things happening right now. So there's a massive amount of noise around tariffs and uncertainty, health of the consumer and the economy, and the correlation to how much of that is this tariff and uncertainty, and then Doge policies and the cutting of government workers and fiscal spending, and then so how much of that's all correlated and related, and then separately what's going on with oil prices, which isn't actually separate because it's very, very correlated to the health of the economy. And I want to start this out by just saying, folks, I've talked to you guys for years about this. I've been talking to clients about this for years. Is that economic crises are, and I'm not calling for an economic crisis, but these black swans, I mean, I used to put in slides like swans, blacks and white and gray. I always say it's like we're in a pool of water, we're in a pond, and we see all the swans right now, and they're just like swimming. It's just like when they swim up to us. So all this information has been out there. The economy has not been healthy for years. Now, the problem is that what we're seeing, and potentially a reality to this, is that the economy has maybe been held up by a massive amount of government spending. And so right now we have over $1 trillion of fiscal deficit, and our interest payments on our debt are actually $1.124 trillion as of Q4. And our military expenditures are just shy of that. So we're just under that. So we're well north of $1 trillion in military expenditures, but our debt is almost as much as that. And that is a real problem. So, the 10-year yield reflects some of that. But that's what, we were thinking, when Trump came into office, or when he was elected into office, a lot of this was based on the economy, right? It was the stickiness of inflation and this persistiveness of inflation. And I say this because I want to try to make the economic pieces as unpartisan as possible. But you are hearing a lot of noise, I think, in the background of the market coverage. So you had Secretary of Treasury Bassett on TV this weekend talking about the economy. You've had Trump talking about the economy as well. And essentially, both of them folks within the Trump administration are acknowledging that there may be a reset or something, or resetting expectations. They don't seem concerned about the stock market coming down. Let's be very honest and very clear about the stock market. That dramatic escalation or run up for the last several years, it needs to cool off. Now, whether or not this is a bear market or just a correction or a healthy correction, those are unclear. But I will say, when I look at all this data, and coming back to this, like all these black swans that have been in the water and now they're just swimming up to you, I think it's Stanley Druckenmiller, who I believe it was last summer, who said on CNBC that, economic crises takes years to form and they take weeks to implode. And so I'm not saying anything's imploding, but typically what happens is it can be a straw that breaks the camel's back. And I think that if you're seeing that if the consumer is if the health of the US economy is rolling over because Elon Musk is cutting jobs in the federal government, then we didn't have a very healthy economy. And I say that very seriously because I mean, I know what this is like. This is not fun. This is extremely painful, and there are real realities. If you have a government contract and you lose it, that can be your business. And so this is happening across the country, but particularly in DC. And then also, if you're government employees, there's a knock-on impact. So whether we want to trim government spending is one thing, but typically, if you're just going after employees, the knock-on impact to the economy is serious. So Jamie Dimon has been on the record for this of talking about the massive government spending. Lots of folks have talked about this, of that, we've had so much fiscal spending, trillions of dollars of fiscal spending that's come up over the last several years and on the back of COVID that's really helped keep the economy, lots of money sloshing around. And eventually the music stops and someone is left without a chair. And it feels like this, if you're trying to rein in your fiscal order. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best way to do it. I think you need to, like, things like government spending. I'm all for taking out big contracts like Wood Mackenzie and not Wood Mackenzie, sorry, McKinsey, big consulting, management consulting. Never been a fan of them. You pay millions of dollars to get a binder at the end. The Middle East could probably save a lot of money in that sector as well. But the point is that we're starting to have these knock-on effects, and the question is, are right now, is it too soon to realize that this is the government, cutting from Doge in the Department of Government Efficiency, cutting jobs in government? Is that already bleeding into the economy? Is it fears of tariffs, or what's going on? And so the market color, and I think is really important, is that Kohl's, their earnings call, I went through this weekend. I went through the Costco earnings call, and I listened to every single, both Delta, United, and Southwest. All their CEOs spoke at this JP Morgan conference, and I listened to all of them this weekend because there was so much noise from last week. And my big takeaway is that Kohl's is telling you that they're kind of the linchpin for the I wouldn't say lower income, but it is lower income. It's $50,000 and under, which they mention, and $100,000 and under. And they say that we are feeling pressure. The consumer at $50,000 and under is definitely feeling pressure, and the consumer $100,000 and under is also feeling pressure. And so somebody pointed out on stock market, some channel the other day, is that, look, because of inflation, $100,000 really isn't that much money anymore. And that's something very, very true. If you are making $100,000, it's just not that much, especially if you're feeding a family. And so I do want to point out is that when we're talking about government jobs, also, people are not making a ton of money, right? So when you take out these jobs, like if you're living in DC and you lose a government contract or you lose a government job, it's very, very expensive to live in DC. So, just keep that in the back of your mind. But Kohl's, I'm not a Kohl's shopper, although I go online and I see awesome, cool Harry Potter stuff, and Barbie stuff and just things, So, I know my sister shops at Kohl's and she shops at TJ Maxx and all these other stores. I'm not a massive shopper, so I'm not one of those people. I tend to shop at used clothing stores and antique stores. So Kohl's though is a place where, when you listen to the earnings call, it's fascinating because they talk about this friction with the consumer, where they've had to increase, they've had to do things to try to get the consumer to spend. So they have coupons. Well, those didn't work out too well. Well, the problem is the pain points of the consumer when they're already having trouble spending, and then you change things within the store. If they're not seeing the things that they want, their loyal consumers don't like that. So there was petites and particular categories that the consumer wasn't seeing the things that they normally get. And then the return policies were sticky. And I don't know if you when you do shopping online, which I do, and I get something and I love it, that's awesome. Like, I'm happy with quality. But when I get that thing in the mail that's like the return sticker and says just pop this in the bag, return it, and it's like a 90-day return policy. Tommy Bahama is one of those. Very expensive store, but typically the stuff is pretty good quality, and it just has this awesome return policy, a lot like Nordstrom's. And so, yeah, you're paying a premium for that, but you can just send it back, no questions asked. You don't have to call and you don't have to do everything. And it was interesting because I heard something like, you hear this a little bit within the Kohl's earnings call, is that consumers are not happy with the returns, and so they end up actually giving them money back at the till or the register. So I'll just point this out. So the reason Kohl's is important and the reason Costco is so important is because Costco is the higher end consumer. So Costco is north of $100,000. And so interestingly enough, when you if you just go to Costco and you look at their website and you look at their investor relations and you look at their presentation, their latest investor presentation, you will see them advertising and promoting the fact that they are moving more brands to Kirkland signature items, to the store brand items. So you are seeing a trade down in the high end consumer on grocery. I think that's a pretty significant thing because we keep hearing from Walmart, they keep getting more and more of the consumers of the north of $100,000, and so basically they're saying we're getting this middle income or upper middle income consumers shopping at Walmart. Absolutely. They want to save money. But what you're seeing at Costco is that they're doing the same thing. So they're trading down. And you hear within the earnings call, particularly on things like beef, where they're trading down from steak to say ground beef, and they're trading down from other things to chicken. So when you just look at the actual inflation, and we had that read last week, inflation came down a smidge, but in categories like you're still about 4% for services, you're still about, which is paying people, you are still about wages, you're still about 4% for shelter, and food inflation is just, it's really sticky. And so it's so important when we're talking about this health of the consumer, and why I'm beating this drum is that I've been talking about this for years, folks, that the consumer has been beaten down by inflation. And so when you have still persistent inflation, even though it's lower than your 10% you had in 2022, it's inflation on top of inflation. So the consumer just keeps going to the grocery store and keeps seeing higher prices. And they are not necessarily they're not necessarily seeing that in the wages. So the problem is, if you're seeing wages, we still increase that. But if you look at average hourly hours worked, that's declining. So the weekly hours that people are working is declining. And what that is telling you is that there are a lot of people with multiple jobs or part-time jobs, and they're having trouble getting to that 40 hours of work week. And so something you've also that's quietly under the hood of employment. And again, this is pre-Trump, this is during Biden, this has been the past several years that's just been happening in this erosion of the economy. And again, really just gets to the weakening consumer. If you have persistent and sticky inflation, and you have and high energy policies, and your high energy prices and high utility costs, and you are working hard to make two jobs, to make the 40-hour work week, your consumer is feeling that pressure. And so now it's starting to really see that in consumer sentiment is where they're concerned about jobs. And so you get that because if you're cutting jobs at the federal government, you're seeing jobs getting lost. And so you start putting some fear into the economy, you start accelerating that fear in the consumer. Well, when you start accelerating fear in the consumer, that can induce actual layoffs because the consumer stops spending, and then those businesses have to start cutting jobs to reflect that and to deal with that. But when we talk about unemployment, we're about this 4.1%. It keeps moving around this level. And so you look okay, right? I mean, Jerome Powell keeps saying like the underlying health of the economy right now looks okay, but the shoe can drop. And so we have this okay employment, but part of that employment piece is the fact that we do have a lot of workers or a lot of employers that have basically reduced the hours worked, right? Or they're not technically part-time, but they are kind of part-time. And so that's why we see this average hourly work week down. And I don't think that it's been on a steady downward trajectory. And so I think that's really serious when we're thinking about recessionary territory. Well, I've been talking to clients for a while too, and I'm looking at like jet fuel right now, jet fuel demand nicely correlated with oil prices. If oil prices kind of were up and tick down, the economy is okay, jet fuel demand is going to go up. Still not at pre-COVID levels. And I'll come back to jet fuel in a minute because we're going to talk about airlines. But if you're looking at Kohl's earnings call and then the Costco earnings call, so I'm just going to quote this. I'm going to read this to you. In the Kohl's earnings calls, they say, quote, I mean, you break down the consumer. I think from a macro perspective, you see a pretty decent bifurcation among income level. We don't see it too much geographically per se, but when you look at income level, if you are making less than 50, that consumer is pretty constrained from a discretionary standpoint. If you're making less than 100, it's also pretty challenging. And you see that very clearly in the numbers. And obviously, we hear the inflation numbers. We felt they're coming down our 2% to 3%, but they're still pretty elevated from particularly a grocery and rent perspective over the past few years because they haven't actually deflated. And then they go on to say, so I'm not sure ways we've kept up with that. So you're in the income cohort. So you have a decent proportion of our consumer base in that. It's a headwind from a macro perspective. If you definitely see that they are seeking out value, you see it in the mix of product we're selling, you see it in the promotions that we're doing. So the point is to say is that they're noting this inflation. And the point is that Kohl's tells you about the lower income or the middle to lower income discretionary spending, right? So they're not buying groceries at Kohl's. They're buying stuff. They're buying Harry Potter stuff and Barbie stuff and clothes and things like that. Now, lots of people need just basic clothes. So not I'm not saying that's all discretionary, but largely discretionary spending. Costco is not necessarily discretionary spending. That is grocery. So if I'm feeling discretionary for the lower income consumer and I'm feeling spending, I'm feeling grocery for the higher end consumer, that's serious. And so I think that's what you're starting to see, all these economic data points. And I say this because when I'm talking to clients and I brief them in, say, like January with Big Deep Dive, I talk about, hey, yes, oil prices were $80 a barrel. I didn't feel like they should be $80 a barrel. And I felt like a lot of these data points, particularly like air traffic and everything, look like they're about to roll over. They just seem too high for the health of the health of the consumer, the health of the economy. And overwhelmingly, I mean, I've been talking about this for a while, so I know I'm on the record for it, but the health of the global economy is not great. It has not been great for years. There's no hotspot for global oil demand, for growth, for economic growth that's going to drive up global oil demand, which is going to drive up prices, which we will get to. We'll come back to oil prices shortly. So Costco earnings call. So Kohl's was March 11th. Costco was March 6th. So I think what happened was you're bringing forward, that was March 6th. That was the week before last. Then you had all this stuff last week. And so you're getting this collectivization of data. The stock market was actually up Friday, but the cross last week, it was an absolute mess. So Costco, and again, I'm reading from here, the earnings call. About a third of our sales in the US are imported from other countries. So they get into tariffs. And so this whole conversation on tariffs, and I'm figuring how best to talk about this in my talk tomorrow at the Houston Producers Forum, is really I don't want to spend too much time on tariffs because I need to see all the policies landing. It is already causing problems in terms of how people are thinking about business, their access to products, and knowing how long is the tariff, say, going to be in place on Canada when I'm trying to buy something. Mexico, I think it could be lasting on Canada, but I think it is going to be lasting on Mexico because I think so much stuff from China is coming in through Mexico and, say, Vietnam. And so if my big point on this, if tariffs are not about China, they damn well should be. But they talk about tariffs. And so people are asking about this in terms of, and you hear about this on the stock market, is how much are tariffs impacting the consumer and how they feel? And is that already starting to impact spending? And so Costco says, indirectly, because they get stuff, right? That's a question about tariffs, is, quote, about a third of our sales in the US are imported from other countries, and less than half of those items are coming from China, Mexico, and Canada. In uncertain times, our members have historically placed an even greater importance on the value of high quality items at great prices, and our teams will continue to rise to the challenge by leveraging our global buying power, strong supplier relationships, and innovation. So they're talking directly to the uncertainty. Now, it does matter because I have a Costco membership and I pay whatever $100 and something a year for that membership. So if they don't continue to see a value, they won't pay that, when they're cutting back. If they're on the lower side of that higher income, and they're in that 100,000 or lower, they might cut those memberships. So when stuff hits, crap hits the fan, things can get really messy. So it's really important that across all these things, anything you listen to, any earnings call, you hear this over and over. The consumer is looking for value. They're looking for differentiated value. So even the higher income consumer is pickier about their spending. They want their dollars to go further and they want a bang for their buck. And so that's hard in a world where you've already had inflation and you continue to have sticky and persistent inflation. So I'm going to continue to read this. Our buyers continue to bring in new and exciting items, blah, blah. They talk about their big TVs. They talk about appliances and everything. I think that's a concern because that's discretionary, right? Jewelry and things that people are buying. But fresh, when we're talking about food, they say, quote, fresh in Q2 was up high single digits. This was led by double-digit growth in meat, where we continue to see a shift toward lower cost proteins such as ground beef and poultry. Bakery and produce also performed well this quarter. Foods and sundries had low to mid-single digit comps, with Kohler and International Foods showing strongest results. We continue to look for ways to increase the value to our members, both with national brand items and our private label offerings. Our goal is to always be the first to lower prices where we see opportunities to do so, and the last to increase prices in the face of rising costs. Really, really serious, folks. The fact that they are highlighting this trade down for the consumer, especially in grocery, and the fact that they're seeing inflation in some categories, deflation in not deflation, but less pressure in others, and this trade down, particularly in proteins, which I mentioned before. I'm going to keep reading. Now a few comments on inflation, where there are a bit of variability across departments. Overall inflation in the quarter was low single digits. Grocery. Fresh was the most inflationary of our categories, driven by meat and bakery. Food and sundries inflation remained relatively low as inflation in eggs, cocoa, coffee, cheese, and corn were particularly offset by deflation in commodities such as sugar, butter, and flour. The supply chain continues to be relatively stable, albeit shipping delivery dates are still less predictable than they were pre-COVID. That's another thing you hear is that, so, nice color on the inflation and nice color in those categories. But I think to really work to get your consumer, like Walmart and Costco are going to be the ones you need to look at for beating out prices, like beating down grocery prices, so they can bring that consumer in. And the supply chain though is something people still talk about. Now, how much of that is a little bit of an excuse if they have issues, but just this the I think the speed, the transactions, tariffs certainly will put uncertainty into supply chain, right? If you're moving around your supply chains right now, you're definitely going to have uncertainty within your delivery times. So they get a question on the consumer, and I put this in here as well because I was thinking about what would my clients want to hear, what would podcast listeners want to hear, and so I want to put this in here as well. Is that they say, um, we are still seeing quote, but they're talking about question about the consumer, and so Costco responds quote, but they are still showing that willingness to spend, but they're being very choiceful where they're spending their dollars, and we think that's likely to continue and maybe even become more choiceful as the impact of some return on of inflation and the potential impact of tariffs could flow through as well. I'd say we're also seeing a continued sign of what I mentioned last quarter, where there's some indication that members are spending a little bit more on food on at home versus food away from home overall. So they're kind of, I guess, the macro themes that we see. That is serious, folks, because when you look at overall food inflation, and I was just pulling it up to put in slides and then delete them, but when you look at food inflation, you have food at home, food away from home, and then the overall food category. And so food inflation is still up. It's not obviously what it was in 2022, but it's still up. And so really, really serious is that I do think people are starting to pare back on restaurants. And I'm looking at the Denver Business Journal. You're looking at a restaurant a week is closing in Denver. Maybe that tells you had an overbuild, but it also tells you that it's hard to run. Like, restaurants are low margin businesses, and so that's a place where you really see inflation. Like, oh my gosh, when you have an 8-9% tax that we have here in Denver, and then you go and then you had this, like, happy tax added, and this 20% automatic gratuity plus give me more gratuity on top of it, it gets really, really painful to go out and have dinner. So I think that is massively important, as this food from home, is that people are leaning into that. And I can tell you, I have just, largely because I've just been busy, but I haven't went out to eat as much. And that's because you get this sticker shock when you go out to eat, and it's so damn expensive. So that's all serious, right? And I think Costco and Kohl's give you this very, very interesting color. And I'm going to have to pause because I have to catch this flight to Houston. But before I do that, I'm going to start by just talking about the airlines because, man, if you have flown lately, it is not a pleasant experience. And I'm about to head to the airport, and I'm hoping that my flight's on time. But several of the last flights I've had have been beyond not on time. I was flying from Denver to DC last week or the week before last, and I had a 9-hour delay. And talk about inflationary, folks. Like, that is such an inefficient system when you have a 9-hour delay. And there were a lot of reasons for it, right? The plane, they had a bad engine, or they had a light blink or whatever, but it took them 4 hours to decide that they couldn't fly that plane. And I think you could get better at engineering. I think you get better checking the systems and have a better process in place where you could know that quicker, and then you could tell the consumers, and they could either rebook something that's sooner, or you could cancel and you could try to get another one. But the problem is there's a lot of inefficiencies in here. And what's sad is that I didn't hear the CEO of United, Scott Kirby, talk to any of this when he was talking about the health of the consumer and things that they're doing with their flights. But you were absolutely seeing, and it's really important to point out, is that jet fuel, as I pointed out, is kind of on this trajectory like this. From COVID, it came down, obviously prices came up, but jet fuel's kind of been like this demand. I've been concerned that I'm thinking it's going to roll over because flying is relatively discretionary as well. It's not so much for if you have to for work, but what you're hearing overwhelmingly is that if you're cutting the government side, they are seeing that, right? So a lot of these airlines leave capacity, they leave seats open for the last minute buyer that's going to buy an expensive ticket, for the business guy or the government guy or the government contractor in the business. So hugely important. So if you so part of all Southwest, Delta, United, part of them all noted this sort of government, this potential weakness within government spending and the cuts from the government. But particularly with Delta, there was so many factors. And so they talk about the plane crash in January. Then they talk about the consumer, the tariffs, everything, just that something else is happening and there's a slowdown. And so this could be a nervousness, a knee-jerk reaction, a fear. It could also be that we've just had so much inflation that's crept up and it's added that you just have this stopping point for the consumer where they've just had enough. And so it's also winter, so you have that. But I think if you also take into account the fact that it's so hard to fly, that it's getting so ridiculous and the flights are delayed and it's expensive, I think you're going to have people that say, no, I'm not going to fly. So there's definitely a lot of noise within the data, but very, very interesting color coming from these CEOs and this conversation. And if you were, I think just these five taken together, they give you caution for the economy. They give you caution about the consumer and about the trajectory of the economy. And I do think when you're looking at just air traffic miles, they are above what they were pre-COVID. So the data on air passenger miles from Fred data actually shows that they came down and then they are actually above. And to me, they looked a little tippity top. And you're now having folks thinking about, is that going to roll over? Okay, so airlines and air traffic gets actually to the heart of oil demand. So it's an important thing to talk about. And after we talk about airlines, we're going to switch and talk about oil, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Fed as well. But airlines here, we're looking, if you're talking about jet fuel demand, and the air traffic miles, I said they look like they're about to roll over. They just look too tippity top. We look at jet fuel demand, and what you see is that pre 2008, jet fuel demand was under 1.8 million barrels per day. Like it's well under this line. But then 2008 happens, and we just erode. Actually, we were kind of eroding even in early 2008, and then the erode, and it takes a while, like a trough. It takes a while for that to come back, and then we've pre-COVID we climbed north and we hit north of 1.8 million barrels of demand, and we were up there. And then COVID happens, we massively decline, just like the whole consumer economy, flying, everything declines. That's when we lost all that oil demand during COVID, and then it spikes back up, and it's taken this trajectory to grow up. Now, part of that is that when you're looking at this chart of jet fuel demand in the U.S., what you see is that this spike in oil prices. So when I chart this and I show this with oil prices, that's what you see is that jet fuel demand does move in line with oil prices. When you have lower prices, especially like we had from say 2015 to 2019, pretty low and stable oil prices, jet fuel demand grew and was healthy. And so it's an important thing to point out is this low and stable prices as your economy is healthier and underlying economy is healthy, you're growing, you can see that rise. Right now, what we had coming out of COVID was the spike in oil prices in 2022. And I think that dampened a little bit from just the race upward. But since then, we've had this upward trajectory. We're still shy of those pre-COVID highs for jet fuel demand, but we're hovering around this 1.8 million barrels a day demand level. So it does get to the heart of this. And so what these airlines are saying, what they're actually telling us is really important. So as I mentioned, the combination of all this together is collectively what is sort of, I think, many things that are weighing on the market. And I'm trying to bring color to this. Now, if you're listening, you will hear no change. But if you're watching, you will see that I've changed my clothes because I recorded that first 25 minutes before I left for the Houston Producers Forum. I've since come back from the Houston Producers Forum. I'm back in Denver and I'm recording this, and I'm going to keep this short and sweet and just give you an update of what's happening on the airline sector because so much of this was actually echoed. So much of this podcast that I recorded that I just re-listened to make sure we would have continuity with these two recordings. So much of this is really what the Federal Reserve Fed chair said today. Today is Wednesday now, March 19th, 2025. And this is what he said today. So everything I said in the previous 25 minutes has been exceptionally relevant. And a lot of it was really reiterated with what the Fed chair said. And I'm going to talk about that shortly. But if you look at the United, what the CEO said in his commentary, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this because United is different than Southwest. I mean, Southwest basically just says we're seeing softness, and holy crap, what Southwest is doing with changing up what they're doing in terms of actually changing the seating, charging for extra legroom and bigger, the basically the economy plus, having seat, basically where people know where they're seating. So having specified seats, and then also charging for bags. That is a big deal. And they spend some time talking at the JP Morgan conference more about that. But they also talk, overall, they're seeing the same softness in the consumer. So United Airlines, and this is a little different than Delta, but United, they say, quote, "We have also seen the weakness in the demand market. It started with government. Government is 2% of our business. Government adjacent, all the other consultants and contracts that go along with that are probably another 2% to 3%. That's running down about 50% right now. So a pretty material impact in the short term." And then breaking this, but continue on with quote. And we've seen some bleed over to that in the domestic leisure market. Good news is the international, long haul, Hawaii, premium all remain healthy and strong. But we have seen government and some low end consumer leisure weakness, which also appears consistent to me with a lot of the other data that we look at. We've had a fuel price benefit from that, and other internal costs are also better. You put all that together, and we now expect to be at the low end of our guidance range. Again, I'm dotting, I'm cutting out some here. A lot of a lot of it is transborder, big drop in Canadian traffic to go to the US. Some of it's going to come from government markets where we've seen less demand, and we're also going to cancel red-eye flights. Utilization flying is generally unprofitable at airlines even in good times, and it's unprofitable in bad times. Further, again, further, particularly with government traffic, there's a short-term yield management effect. But I think by the time we get to August next year, like we've got just like we got to August of last year, there's going to be huge. Every analyst is going to be writing about capacity cuts and supply changes, and it's just economics. So he really gets, I thought that was the quote. That's what I shared with the client last weekend. I think that's the quote that you need to take away from United is they're talking about this. Now, the same sentiment gets echoed from Delta. So we're talking about this capacity and yield. So basically they're saving certain seats for the last minute for folks to book, which I talked about. So United is saying they're cutting the red eyes. I believe it's Southwest or someone who said they're actually adding them, or Southwest is saying they're adding them. So essentially, United is saying they're not making money on those flights anyway. I will say that flight that was delayed that I took to DC was one of the first flights I've been on in a very long time that was not completely full. Usually, that DCA, that Reagan, or that Denver to DCA or Reagan flight is completely full. And what's very interesting is that's what Delta was talking about. And Delta really gets into the heart of this, of that they were hearing, they saw all this, the beginnings of changes from the beginning of this year, and they weren't quite sure what it was. And now they feel more confident that it is the health of the consumer and a compounded effect about what's going on in the economy. Okay, so Delta starts talking and they say, hey, we've had all this weather. We had the accident in earlier this year. So we had an accident in the DC accident that was American Airlines. And they talk about how there's a whole generation of consumers that didn't know that we could have accidents like this. And they thought that was impacting consumer behavior. And then they had all this weather. But despite all that, they were actually feeling okay. And then they say, quote, that dropped into the low single digits quickly as we started to so they're saying we thought the first quarter was going to be strong, and then they say, quote, that dropped in the single digits quickly. And we started to in February, we wanted to see that recover and people getting through the incident and start to find a more stable ground. It never really happened. In that close in booking, that corporate confidence, that consumer sentiment continues to stay a bit lagged, as in we are looking at it. Um, and we thought it was a little bit odd that it was taking time for it to recover. Then, unfortunately, we had our own incident. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt, but we had our own incident February 17th, and that fed into another round of delay. And it became pretty quickly obvious to us that there was more than just consumer sentiment. There was more than just consumer sentiment coming out of the incidents, that there was something there, or period, there was something going on with economic sentiment, something going on with consumer confidence. And we were seeing that very much in close in bookings. We were able to hold our advantage, our advanced booking at a decent clip, but it was the close in that we were having a difficult time closing. And to make matters worse, we were positioned for close end bookings. Again, if you've got a supply base and a supply balance that we've all felt has been quite comfortable, we see a lot of demand in the market. Where we see a lot of demand in the market. Of course, you're going to be holding out on pricing for better yield management, for better inventory. And we were in that positioning, waiting for a close in that never materialized. So I apologize for botching that quote a little bit, because we're reading somebody talking. But the point to make here is that both United and Delta talk about those close in bookings and those yield management. And Delta's extremely honest, saying that we were actually positioned to capture that money on that close in booking. Something I would think you could reference this a little bit to is LNG. The people who made money in 2022 were the folks that were open to the spot market, that didn't have the long term contracts baked in, contracted a lower price, it was the people that were open. So Delta is talking about we were basically we were capitalizing on the close-in bookings of these people booking at these last minute, making this money, and we were waiting for that, and that didn't materialize. So I think these are really, I think the commentary here is really serious. We see this also from Southwest. Obviously, I mentioned all the stuff that's going on with Southwest. Southwest says basically, quote, and this is the only single quote I put in here because it's the most important. They said, but we're seeing what we're seeing now. They're saying what we're seeing now, quote, is a kind of broad softness in the macro economy that is hard to attribute to any one thing. And I thought that was really good because all of these guys, at least Delta and Southwest, are talking about a number of things happening. I think United gives you the most color on the government side. And I do think it's really important to appreciate, as I opened up this podcast, with the fact that a lot of people are knowing. I mean, I have government contracts. A lot of people know people with government contracts that are getting cut. If you are a business that is relying, if you are a government contractor or you're a government employee and you're losing your job, things like flights, immediate flights, your behavior is going to change very quickly. So, also, if so much of your economy it was tilted toward government spending and government jobs, which it seems to be pre-Trump, so much of this growth in our economy was definitely in the government growth or government adjacent. That's really important, and that is something we actually heard Jerome Powell talk about today. So I'll probably spend a little more time talking about the Fed's comments because this podcast is intended to be March 17th. Happy St. Patrick's Day. But now I'm recording the tail end of this podcast on March 19th. And so I can't help myself but telling you that the Jerome Powell talked, and he really reiterated a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, the health of the consumer and consumer confidence. And so something really important I think that did for me came from this is that he did not give a lot of credence or credibility to the consumer confidence survey that came out from Michigan. So that was one of the things that had a lot of noise in the stock market last week. A lot of the commentary you're hearing before and after Jerome Powell spoke, the stock market is saying that a lot of people are saying, "Hey, we're only down 3.5% now in the S&P for the year." Well, we were nearing this sort of 10%, so there's been some recovery across the stock market. But something you heard was that Jerome Powell saying, "I'm not giving this consumer sentiment to a survey." I've yet to see the actual charts from the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey. What they showed was the one of them that has the data points where it's Republican, Independent, and Democrat, and the sentiment is much poorer for and obviously on inflation as well. It's much poorer for Democrats when there's a Democrat in office and they don't like the economy. You see it for Republicans think it's great if there's a Republican in office. Democrats think it's great if there's a Democrat in office. We certainly saw this under Biden, especially when we had high inflation. And we're seeing this under Trump with that flip. So that's important to just point out is that I thought Jerome Powell said, hey, he didn't give much credence to that because what he's saying is the hard data that they have, like that's soft data. That's what the consumer's saying. The hard data that they have in terms of where inflation is at, where GDP, where actual economic growth is, and where unemployment is, that they're doing okay right now. And so they think they're in a decent position to either to react to whatever happens in the economy. And so he basically said, and I put some quotes in here, quote, low hiring and low firing. So while I think the consumer is feeling anxious, and so if you, like I said, if you know somebody or you hear people getting laid off or you know people who are getting laid off, that feels closer to you and it doesn't feel really great. Or if you lose your job, it's taking you a longer time to get a job. That's definitely real. But in terms of the actual employment, and again, as I talked about, under the hood looks different. He's saying, quote, things are highly uncertain. And so in addition to all these things he says, we have slower growth. We have overall okay on labor market, slight uptick in inflation, moderating in spending. Then he says, but incredible uncertainty. And so I think one of the big takeaways, in addition to what I just said, is the fact that he says things are highly uncertain. That's what you hear from the airlines. I wouldn't say that's definitely what you hear from Kohl's and Costco's. Things are highly uncertain. I think but they're recognizing that there's massive uncertainty for the consumer right now. And so the Fed is talking to high uncertainty within the overall economy because right now they do have okay growth. They have 2% GDP. They've got 4.1% unemployment, and they have basically 2.5% inflation. He does talk also about, people being unhappy. And he says that, people are asking, he gets lots of questions and people are asking about the persistent inflation. And he says, quote, we have 4.1% unemployment and 2% growth. It's pretty good. Then he says, people are unhappy because I was writing fast, so it's kind of a quote, kind of not. People are unhappy because previous high inflation and high prices at the grocery store. So what I was saying at the beginning of this, the problem with that is that I don't think I don't think he's appreciating that it's the cumulative effect of inflation. So he says that now people are making more money. The wage inflation growth is higher than inflation, and so people are taking home more. You heard this a lot in the previous administration, where they were upset with the people's reaction to the economy, saying, you're doing better. We have low unemployment. People have jobs, and yes, we have inflation, but you're making more than that. The problem is, I think a lot of people aren't. If you're a consultant like me, you're not necessarily, your wages do not go up. Like, people aren't going to necessarily pay you more because you have inflation. That is not how it works. And in fact, if the economy is weakening, you have to fight tooth and nail for that. So I think there's a lot of people who have not seen commensurate wage increases. And the problem is, if you're making $50,000 or $100,000 a year and you have a family to feed, even slight increases on top of those massive increases are huge. And so we're still seeing, and to point out, you're still seeing over 4% in services. You're still seeing over 4% in housing, for inflation. So he doesn't talk about that directly, and that is frustrating. He does talk about tariffs. And I will say, I think the Fed pulled back a little bit in their rhetoric, in terms of, like, he literally said, we don't want to address policy. Well, it's kind of too late for that, because he said that in the previous administration, we're not going to address fiscal spending and policy, and it's not my place. But since then, the Fed has been very vocal about tariffs and immigration. He did not talk about immigration, in at least what I could hear in his opening comments or what he was asked. He didn't talk about immigration, and he seemed to want to pull back a little bit on talking directly about Trump policy, although he did address tariffs. And really, he said, we don't have enough data points to say tariffs are going to do anything. And so he's asked a lot about, will they look through this inflation? And he talks about one thing that really got to me. He said, before, when we had tariffs under Trump, we had inflation on, say, washing machines, but we also saw that in dryers, but it wasn't actually dryers that were tariffed. Well, okay. Newsflash to Jerome Powell. When people replace a washing machine, sometimes they think they should replace the dryer. It's like, sometimes you replace both light bulbs when you changed them years ago and one is out. I'm not saying I always do that, but people do that. And a washer and dryer, you end up with a brand new washer and this really old dryer. You might, well, like, I would like to get a new set. I'm going to get a set. I'm probably not going to get one. But sometimes they go out, and some people do that. It is not like the people who are buying sets are just going to buy them together. So the timing of that, if your economy isn't eroding, you're probably just going to buy two. If you're not doing well and your washer goes out, you're probably just going to replace the washer. So I just thought that was kind of silly economics, that maybe he isn't the person that makes a decision on buying a washer and dryer in his household. But quote, he says, ultimately too soon to be seeing significant economic effects from tariffs, when he's talking about tariffs and asked about tariffs. And he also talks about, when he's asked about tariffs, he's saying that in the first two, he talks to it quite a few times, but he says, look, we don't have any clarity on this. And the first 2 months of the year, he said, we did have an increase in goods inflation, and that he wasn't necessarily attributing that to tariffs, but that was something. Well, look, you have to be careful with that, because there's reasons that the Fed thinks they're comfortable right now, is that because if we have inflation from tariffs or something, an erosion, higher labor or higher unemployment can erode your inflation. So higher unemployment can take care of inflation. And that's why a lot of times the Fed, when they raise interest rates and they raise them higher, they definitely lower inflation. And so your lag effect is rising unemployment, and that absolutely cools off inflation. The problem is if we have this uptick in goods inflation, I'm not necessarily believing that this is. We have to know why this is, right? Is this tariffs that are driving goods inflation in January and February, or is this demand? So if it's not coming from demand, and it's not coming from tariffs, what's it coming from? Is it coming from the fact that we have Houthis attacking ships in the Red Sea and they've rerouted everything, and finally good shipping, or you're just seeing something like that? Is it because people are concerned about tariffs, so they started buying a lot of it, and so we ended up seeing some hoarding? I'm not hearing this. We didn't hear this from at least like Costco or Kohl's, but he didn't clarify what is driving the goods inflation in January, February. All he said is it isn't clear how they can discern what's coming from tariffs. And he said it was going to be very difficult for the Fed to discern what was actually inflation that's coming from tariffs versus not from tariffs. So just another few notes on what I captured for what he was saying, especially in the Q&A. He said that, sentiment has fallen off sharply, but activity has not. And there was a huge emphasis on this, that labor conditions are solid, and that we are, while the sentiment and the concerns, stuff that you hear in the consumer sentiment survey, stuff you're hearing from airlines, he was saying, this isn't material. the stuff with the airline seems material. We'll see how lasting it is, but the fact that they can attribute this is directly to the government, that seems material. When he was asked about talking about employment or government adjacent employment like healthcare and like education, he admits that there are some government adjacent employment. But when he was asked directly about policy, he said that he wasn't going to talk about it. He says, quote, there the more important thing now is about risks, employment and their employment and inflation mandates. And really, he's talking about when he balancing their employment and inflation mandates and how they're going to balance them and in being in tune to risks. He also says that what matters most to the macroeconomy is material and persistent changes to the economy. He says, quote, the real economy is in good shape, but that the data surveys are showing volatility. And so there's this, I would say my takeaway was not that it was overly dovish or overly hawkish, but that he wasn't leaning too far into these. He was definitely leaning into the uncertainty and that it's very, very cloudy. He didn't seem to lean too far into the negativity because he said underlying the hood, the hard data that they have for the economy is solid. It's not amazing, but it's solid. And that the soft data is the uncertainty, and that uncertainty can breed more uncertainty. And so I think we just, that was very interesting to me because I recorded this previous, that previous 25 minutes. And I would say that commentary and that color made me far more nervous and uncertain. And I'm not sure I think the Fed is balancing a delicate rope, but they are being somewhat honest in saying they don't have all the information and they can't tell you the economy is we're doing okay now, but we're not going to slip off a cliff. Obviously, it's not healthy for if they came in and said we're slipping, that would move the market, that would move sentiment and everything. So it's important for them to strike a balance. Okay, and lastly, I'm just going to close a little bit by talking about oil prices and oil. So the oil executives did meet with Trump. I did not see this. I just saw the New York Times report or the New York Times document that came out, or New York Times article that came out of, quote, what oil executives want from President Trump, and what they were talking about. I can tell you that when I was at this Houston Producers Forum, and I will talk about this more when I drop that podcast, what I was being asked, and I was asked a lot of, everyone asks me, what does drill baby drill mean, and what does Trump want for oil prices? That is a overwhelming theme that I get from folks within the industry of what they ask. Nobody knows exactly what Trump wants. I think people have talked about $50 or $60 a barrel. But what does drill baby drill means that's an increasing theme of what people say. And they say, how can we drill baby drill if we don't have higher oil prices? And I say what I say to them, and I think what you heard within at least what I'm seeing from the articles is that, look, the industry or the White House is saying we are open for business. That's what they're telling the oil and gas industry. We want you to be able to have access to permits and access to leases. And we're also saying separately that we do want lower prices for the consumer. So there's a kind of two tails going on here, and it's the building out infrastructure. It's approving LNG export permits. It's probably allowing natural gas prices to be a little bit higher, but it's also having slightly lower oil prices, and seeing that directly go into the consumer. Obviously, the Trump administration, someone's going to have to address electricity prices directly, like looking at the utilities and that major gap that we have in natural gas prices versus what the consumer is paying, which, as I've mentioned a number of times, is $2 an MCF last year for Henry Hub in 2024, and the average price that the residential consumer paid was $18 an MCF. So those are really big. But in terms of what's going on with prices and why we're seeing the 67, 68 and the flirting when it drops and the flirting when it goes up a little bit. So I would say we're still seeing pressure on oil prices. Now, what we've seen, and while I was actually speaking at the Houston Producers Forum, have not had a chance to dive into it, but while that was taking place, Putin and Trump were on a call, and it apparently lasted like 2 hours. So I don't have massive hot takes from this because I want to have more time to think about this and process it. But the result of that was not that we didn't see a big move in oil prices. We know if you go to the Secretary of Treasury website, you are seeing that we are having multiple sanctions on Iran. So we're looking at oil prices and we're thinking, what's moving the needle? I would say that oil prices have been telling you about the consumer for a while. They've been telling you about the health of the economy for a while. And so actually last year, when you still had the market euphoria and you had everything, and again, part of why the stock market was we were taking a bath on the stock market in some areas is because it was too hot. It was too hot to handle. It did not price in this sort of economic uncertainty. And a lot of that is because so many folks thought that I don't know if they didn't expect tariff policies first. They maybe expected tax cuts. I still think I do really believe that the Trump administration does want deregulation. They do want to enforce and implement these sustained tax cuts, which they're going to have to actually pass. So they want to make sure that goes through. So the stock market was baking in a lot of euphoria. A lot of this had to do with the Magnificent Seven and tech and everything, and all that because the underlying economy, I think globally and in the U.S. was not that healthy, as I'm pointing out. Once those black swans swim up to you, it's easy for you to freak out and start selling off. So that's what I think has been happening. And so the market is actually looking for reasons to move lower, not higher. But that all being said, is that's this 66, 67, $68 a barrel. They have been telling you for quite a while that the $80 a barrel in January was an anomaly when we had sanctions put on Russia by the Biden administration in January for barrels that were going to come off the market, that 1.5 million barrels a day that was going to be sanctioned of vessels moving Russian crude oil. That hasn't happened. And you actually have the call between Putin and Trump didn't resolve anything. So I haven't got to hear the call. I haven't got to see it. I listened to Ukraine cast. It looks like Putin has agreed to a ceasefire that isn't a total ceasefire, but just a ceasefire of stopping attacking energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Obviously, that's probably not going to be enough for Ukraine or the U.S. or Europe, for that matter. That's not a ceasefire. So there's a big question mark there, but oil prices didn't go up on that. I would say that the economy seems to be weighing a little bit more. So it's the health of the global economy, the fact that we don't have global economic growth, and the fact that we have so much supply. So the Saudis are saying they're going to bring barrels back to the market. We know we already have enough supply. We know that the Saudis are at 9 million barrels a day of production right now, and that Russia's over 10 million barrels a day of production. We are at 13.5 million barrels a day of production. So we know we have a well-supplied global market, especially for the health of this economy. So we know all of that. And then we also know we have this ongoing, so we have that, but we have this ongoing war in Israel, with Israel and Hamas in Gaza that has been renewed. So Israel is is reattacking Gaza again. We don't have a ceasefire there. I don't think we have a ceasefire in place right now between Russia and Ukraine by any means. And so we have these two hot wars that are ongoing. We have the U.S. We are now, going after Iran, full-throated, going after Iran and saying we were going to hold you responsible for attacks from the Houthis in the Red Sea. And so the U.S. the U.S. went after the Houthis within Yemen over the weekend. And so none of this has driven up oil prices. And so that's telling you a few things. Could be that traders are absolutely getting this wrong. We probably should have a little bit more of a geopolitical risk premium, or it's that the health of the underlying economy is quite poor. And I think that that's true if we're thinking about just where we're going to get this growth, or that things are starting to roll over and that we have a lot of supply. So I think my conclusion to this is we have an exceptional amount of uncertainty in the market and a lot of volatility. And my real takeaway for you all is to realize that if this, I really think you can take to the bank the stuff that Kohl's is saying, the stuff that Costco is saying, the stuff that the airlines are saying. Those are real, right? Those are how, even if nothing has technically happened, that's how the consumer is feeling and that's how they're behaving, and that can eventually move into actual oil price or oil demand, which can move into oil prices. And I think we're already seeing that because that's been happening over the course of this past year or so, and it's been seen within a good chunk of the economy. And you see that in diesel demand, you see that in gasoline demand. We have not seen growth. In fact, we've actually seen some softness. So, okay, lastly, before I say goodbye to everyone, so I spoke at the Houston Producers Forum on Tuesday, on March 18th, 2025. This will become a podcast. It was extremely well received, so that was awesome. It was such a great crowd. It was awesome to talk to the board beforehand. And when I drop that, I'll talk more about that conversation and some of those questions as well. And you will hear questions from the audience, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So they gave me 40 minutes, and I ended up able to speak a little bit longer and a lot of Q&A. So really, really phenomenal group. I will be headed to Lubbock, Texas on Sunday, and I'm talking to the law school and the students there and the community there on March 24th in Lubbock, Texas. So really pumped about that. On April 1st, I will be speaking at the Colorado School of Mines, which is an open forum as well. So please get in touch with Colorado School of Mines. It's with the Payne Institute with Morgan Bazillion. So that's going to be awesome. And then will be on April 9th, 10th, and 11th. I believe it's April 10th that I'm speaking at the Montana Tech Symposium. So lots in the queue. There's a lot of great podcasts as well that are in the queue from earlier this year that I'll be dropping that gives you some really good color and context, some of them very geopolitical and sort of defense focused as well. So thank you guys so much for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.